Professor Graham Allison, thank you for visiting UNC today. You are an expert on America's national security strategy, you are a geostrategic thinker for the country's foreign policy, and you have dealt extensively in the recent past with US-Chinese relations. How do you evaluate the current state of American-Chinese relations, and is China a serious competitor for disputing and competing with America's predominant role in the world today?
Well, thank you. It's a good question. It's complicated, obviously, but I think we haven't quite got our heads around yet the scale of the problem. That the rise of China over the last quarter century is something unparalleled in history. Never in history has a country risen so far, so fast, in so many different dimensions. And the rise of a great power that could potentially threaten to displace a ruling power, even if only in the Pacific in the foreseeable future, is generally a story that turns out badly. So I've suggested that a concept or lens for thinking about what's going on is Thucydides Trap, in which I read and capture the insight that Thucydides taught us about the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC, where the rise of Athens, and as he said, the fear that this instilled in Sparta, made the war almost inevitable. So basically, the idea that China is rising to the extent that it is, and has done, and is likely to continue to do, and that the rising China will be more assertive, will have a greater sense of its own interest, will demand more influence over events, on the one hand, and that the US, which did in fact create the post-World War II order, an economic and security and political order, that's actually provided the environment in which China has emerged and been able to rise, will feel threatened by a China that wants to say more about who controls which island in the South China Sea, or what happens on a loan, or what happens in a particular, who's the most influential party in Myanmar.
So is it like the rise of Germany in the late 19th century? Is that a justified comparison?
That's a good analogy. In the study that I've done, I found 16 cases in the last 500 years, of which the rise of Germany and the fear that this instilled in Britain is a very vivid example, where basically who would have imagined, certainly not most Brits in 1870, when Germany wasn't even yet a country, that in 30 years there would be a Germany that's unified, that would be industrially surging and producing a GDP equal to Britain. So this created a great deal of fear in Britain. And then as Germany began to build up a navy that seemed to threaten the British Navy, dynamics took over that look a lot like what you see in the story of Athens and Sparta when Thucydides writes about it.
But don't the Chinese have a point? You know, we have the Monroe Doctrine and an American sphere of influence also extending into Europe now, and during the Cold War, Western Europe. Shouldn't the Chinese have their own sphere of influence? Shouldn't the South China Sea, the East China Sea be really China's sphere of influence? And the Chinese questioned, what the hell are the Americans doing in Southeast Asia? Isn't that justified, or how do you evaluate that?
I don't know whether it's justified, but I would say it's normal. So I think that if Americans were Chinese, or if we could imagine ourselves in the equivalent situation, we would look and say, well, why should this foreign power be the arbiter of events in the Caribbean or in the Western Hemisphere? Now, Americans take for granted that, well, I guess this is our hemisphere, as if that was in the Constitution or whatever. No, that was the Monroe Doctrine, as you said. It actually wasn't much enforced because we were too weak to enforce it until we became strong. But when the US rose to rival Britain at about the same time the Germans were rising, we began to be more assertive ourselves about who should be the arbiter in the Caribbean, not the Spanish, who should be the arbiter in the Atlantic, not the British, not the Germans. So I think that it's important for us to understand in Thucydidean terms that it is quite normal, that is, it would be to be expected, that a state that is more powerful will think that its interests deserve more different deference, and will be more insistent, and will be more assertive, and will find the status quo unsatisfactory. So the challenge then for the US and China will be to figure out, as this evolves, how they can accommodate each other's interests in some instances, where there are really bright lines on the other hand. So if you take Taiwan as a very good case, there I would say that's a positive. That suggests that maybe Americans and Chinese are smarter than Athens and Sparta proved to be, or that Germany and Britain proved to be, because what used to be a fighting matter, the Chinese have wisely shelved for 50 years, so we're not in a rush, and the Americans have said, as long as the Chinese don't attack Taiwan if unprovoked, however the Taiwanese and the Chinese work this out, it's good enough with us. I'd say that would be a positive case. And similarly, I would say in the Scarborough Shoals, Chinese basically asserted control over the Philippine Islands. We say we don't have any claim on any of these islands. We wish that the parties would agree to submit these to international arbitration on a regional basis, but I don't think we're going to be prepared to fight about it. On the other hand, if you say in the East China Sea, where Japan and China are at loggerheads over what the Japanese call the Senkakus, the Chinese the Diaus, we've said to the Chinese and to the Japanese, Japan is our military ally. We're guaranteed them that if they're attacked by China, we have their backs. So these territories were given to were given to Japan as part of Okinawa. We're not taking any position on whose they were in history or ultimately, but we're saying if you get into a conflict over these islands, you're going to find us there. So that's a kind of it gets nuanced, but I would say there's evidence that the parties are being able to make some distinctions.
Okay, thank you. What people are wondering, of course, is there is fierce economic competition, there's geopolitical rivalry. Will that eventually lead to war? Will there be military conflict between the two greatest powers in the world?
Well, I think certainly economic competition doesn't necessarily imply war. And actually, because the Chinese have chosen an economic strategy that leaves them so dependent on exports, and because we're their primary market, they don't want to have a war with the guy who's buying all their stuff. Similarly, they've chosen a strategy that leaves them dependent on deliveries of oil across the sea lanes. And the U.S. Navy will continue to be the guardian and arbitrator of the Blue Water Navy, Blue Waters, for decades to come. So again, they don't want to get into a conflict over that. So I think you can imagine very fierce economic competition, as you will see in, when Chinese are bidding for something that they're interested in, they have a lot of money, they probably will succeed in buying it.
So you're optimistic there won't be a war?
Well, I'm optimistic that if the parties think about the lesson, first if they recognize that there's a much bigger chance of a war than they would think. Because I think most Americans and many Chinese don't get it, that because of the Thucydidean dynamic, normal behavior, just normal behavior, will end up in a war. So you're looking for abnormal behavior. So you got to be smarter, more careful, more cautious. But if we take that into account, and if we look at the lessons that we can learn from both the failures and the success, then I'm ultimately optimistic.
So we need a new kind of great power relationship.
That's right, and I think the term is actually quite good, because when Xi Jinping coined this term, what means new? And he has the idea that old is when rising power rivals ruling power, things don't work out very well. So new is somehow we find a way to compete very hard, but not to end up in shooting each other.
What is Russia's role in all that? The Chinese and the Russian leader are close. The United States is at loggerheads with Russia, though they may be temporary, one never knows. But do we see, let's say, Russia and China ganging up against the United States and being that way quite strong and quite formidable, so that the United States is really going to lose out as a predominant world power?
Well, it's a good question, and again, complicated, obviously, but I think there's no question, and most Americans don't realize how thick the relationship between the leadership in Russia and the leadership in China are. Xi Jinping and Putin get on way better than they get on with any of the other parties, certainly than with the Americans, or with any Europeans, or with even with the Indians. So the marriage is currently, I think, a marriage of convenience. China, I think the Chinese leaders imagine that Russia is a waning power, but that has nonetheless lots of natural resources, and in any case is adjacent to China. So I think if the U.S. should find itself in direct war with China, it's possible Russia would be of some assistance, or it's possible Russia would take that as an opportunity to fry some other fish in Europe. And similarly, if the U.S. was in a conflict with Russia, I would say it's conceivable China would ally with Russia, but I would bet not likely, but I would bet China might take advantage of the opportunity to solve some problems in its regions. So this is more like a marriage of convenience.
What about the Europeans and the EU? We haven't mentioned them at all. Do they play a role at all, or are they really just minor players?
Well, that's another long and interesting topic. So the EU and the European experiment is, I think, the great romantic political and economic experiment of our lifetimes. So the idea that states that used to be at war are submerging sovereignty in some collective political entity with a common economic framework is amazing. I mean, it's genuinely amazing from the perspective of history or political theory. The fact that it's very bumpy and lots of ups and downs, I would say there's no news there. And this is hard work. If you look at the American story trying to build a country, we first had a Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation. It didn't work very well. Oh, then we got a Constitution. Well, it didn't work too well either for a while. Then we had a Civil War. So basically, making a country that works together, that holds together, and that is participatory and democratic is hugely, hugely, hugely ambitious. So I would say, nonetheless, the European economy story has been outstanding, and the fact that some of the parties, like the Greeks, have been slackers is a problem, and maybe they'll go in, maybe they'll go out. I think if they go out, I do not anticipate that this is going to be the end of the euro. I think they've now figured out, their way good enough. On the other hand, in the security realm, I'd say EU and Europe has essentially opted out. So they've decided, more or less, that there'll be a security war now for the Americans, and NATO still remains a framework for this. But if you look at both a level of spending, but equally, or maybe worse, what the parties actually buy, the amount of fighting force you have is quite limited. And so when an event happens, like in Ukraine, Europe can engage in economic sanctions, and they're having a big impact. And Europe has been a leader in this space. But militarily, there's not much to do. And similarly in the Baltics, where the ball. I mean, unlike Ukraine, Ukraine was not a member of any alliance that required us to come to its defense, or Europeans. But the Baltics are members of NATO, and so is Germany and Britain and France and the US. So we are obliged under the terms of NATO to regard an attack upon Estonia as an attack upon us, and to try to come to its defense. Well, that's a big problem. And I think the fact that the European forces are so weak now makes that not so credible. And it's therefore is this continuing stress between the U.S. and
regarding China, the Europeans are siding with the U.S.
Well, I would say with respect to China, if you look at this new infrastructure bank, the Europeans were pretty quick to side with China rather than the U.S., even though the U.S. pressed our closest ally, Britain, extremely hard. Don't do this, but the Chinese have the money, and usually that's like gravity.
Thank you very much. We could go on forever, but thank you very much, Professor Graham Allison. Your insights were very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.